So I'll wait to skip you, Lee. This is Magister Buddy with the Stage 31 lesson on ablative absolutes. Quick review on our ablative uses. So far we have two. The first one that we've had since Stage 1 is the object of a preposition. For example, Grumio is cooking in the kitchen. Metella is sitting in the atrium. We more recently learned an expression of time, so time when something happened. So at the 9th hour, he came to the palace, or on the 10th day, she left. And yes, I know you're just dying to learn another use of the ablative. So here's the ablative absolute. It is fairly basic in the beginning, at least. It is an ablative noun plus an ablative participle. Those two things together make an ablative absolute. It is a type of subordinate clause. Its function is to define some circumstances or the situation in which the action of the main verb occurs. So it's just explaining the circumstances surrounding the main verb. The ablative noun is the subject of the ablative absolute. This is super important to remember. There can be other information between the noun and the participle, and that will make more sense when we see some examples. Let's look at the perfect passive. Urbe capta milites discaserunt. After the city was captured, the soldiers left. Now the present active. Omnibus tacentibus libertus nomina recitavit. So while everyone was silent, the freedmen read out the names. And now the perfect active. Domino egresso servi garrire coperunt. After the master had gone out, the slaves began to chat. Notice how I translated them. Both perfects are translated with after. That's because the perfect happened before the main verb. The present I translate as while. That's because the present is happening at the same time as the main verb. This may have thrown you off a little bit. Was silent. Why did I translate a present participle in a past tense? Well, that's because, like I just said, the present participle is happening at the same time as the main verb. Our main verb here is perfect. So while everyone was silent, the freedmen read out the names. All right, let's do some practice. Starting off with our perfect passives. Copy down the sentence, underline any modifiers, draw arrows to their antecedents. Put these squiggly brackets around your ablative absolutes, and then parentheses around prep phrases, mark all other words, and then write out your translation. All right, first sentence. Here we've got our ablative absolute. This is our ablative noun, so it's the subject of our ablative absolute. We've got our ablative participle. In our main clause, we've got nominative subject, accusative direct object, and our main verb. So after the arch had been dedicated, the citizens returned home. All right, we've got our ablative noun and our ablative participle. In our main clause, we've got our nominative subject, our complementary infinitive, and our main verb. So after the money had been lost, the slave girl began to cry. Ablative noun, ablative participle equals an ablative absolute. In our main clause, we've got our nominative subject, our direct object accusative, and our main verb. So after the victims had been sacrificed, the soothsayer announced the omens. Now let's do some present ones. Remember, the main difference with the present is that it is happening at the same time as the main verb. All right, so we've got our ablative noun, our ablative participle, nominative subject, and our main verb. So while the guards were sleeping, the captives escaped. Here we have our ablative absolute. We've got our ablative noun. We've got an ablative participle. In the middle of it, we have a prep phrase. That's fine. This is still our ablative absolute here. Over here, we've got our nominative subject, an adverb, and our main verb. So again, because it's present, we're going to translate it as while. So while the parade was proceeding through the streets, the spectators loudly applauded. Here we have an ablative absolute in the middle of the sentence. So ablative noun, ablative participle. Here we have an adjective. It's modifying Tito because these are both dative. Back to the beginning, we've got a nominative subject, accusative direct object, dative indirect object, and our main verb. So the emperor offered prayers to divine Titus while the priests were standing by. And I could have done this a couple of different ways. I could have translated the ablative absolute in the middle. I could have done it in the beginning. So we could do the emperor, while the priests were standing by, offered prayers to divine Titus. This is somewhat flexible. All right, and our last one, the perfect active. Okay, so again, the perfect, you're going to translate it as after. And because it's active, make sure the subject of your ablative absolute is doing the participle. All right, so we've got an ablative noun, an ablative participle. This is our ablative absolute. We've got an adjective here. Both of these are nominative, feminine, singular. Race is our subject, nominative, and our main verb. So after the merchant had set out, a horrible thing happened. Here we have an ablative noun, an ablative participle. Again, we have a preposition in the middle of it. That's fine. It's still part of our ablative absolute. We've got our nominative subject, accusative direct object, and our main verb. So after the messengers returned from Britain, the emperor summoned the senators. Here we have our ablative absolute because we have an ablative noun, we have an ablative participle. Hike is our direct object. This is the neuter accusative plural of hic, hike, hoc. So we're going to translate it as these things. Over here we have a nominative subject. This is a predicate nominative and our linking verb. So after the consuls said these things, everyone was shocked. All right, Discipuli, a couple things to remember. An ablative absolute is comprised of a noun and a participle, both of them in the ablative. The ablative noun is the subject of the ablative absolute. Make sure that you're translating the ablative noun as the subject, regardless of the type of participle that's there. There can be stuff between the two, such as prep phrases, and we saw a couple examples of that. It is a type of dependent clause and is explaining the circumstances of the main verb. So it cannot stand alone. That's why we bracket it out when we're marking up our sentences. For the perfect participles, we're going to translate the absolute as after. For the present participles, we're going to translate the absolute as while. Wale te discipuli.